So welcome back. My name is Kathy Woodward. I'm director of the Simpson Center for the Humanities at the University of Washington and a member of the International Advisory Board of the Consortium of Humanities Centers and Institutes. It's my great and good pleasure to introduce to you Wendy Chung, who I know is so well known to you for her important work in new media, in critical race studies, and in critical theory. She is spirited, she is intrepid, and she's thoroughly committed to finding ways to working with communities and people to find ways for us to inhabit and use new media, the digital spaces we live in, and not be used by them. She is also stunningly prolific. I'm going to mention the title of 3 books that have appeared within the space of 10 years: Power and Paranoia in the Age of Fiber Optics, Programmed Vision, Software and Memory, and most recently, Updating to Remain the Same. I love the title. Habitual New Media, all published by MIT Press, and there's another one in the works. I want to just say a few words about Updating to Remain the Same. It's theoretically expansive, and at the same time, and I think this is rare, it is direct, and it's at times colloquial, and it's inventive. I love the use of aphorisms that you've invented to describe the developments in the digital spaces in the history of the present. It's also, in addition to being provocative, moving in ways that I didn't expect, and I find this to be a new dimension in your work. I'm in particular admiration of a chapter that focuses on gender, shame, race, and secrets in a medium, the internet, in which there are no longer any secrets. Now, many of you are going to think of, and you know of, Wendy as a professor in the celebrated Department of Modern Culture and Media at Brown University. I am actually prideful and happy to report that Wendy has accepted this coveted position as a Canada 150 Research Chair in New Media at Simon Fraser University, which is located in Vancouver on the West Coast. So she is moving near, regionally, may I say, us and the Cascadia corridor. We're thrilled, very, very thrilled. One of her goals there is to develop in tandem with others at FU and with communities and colleagues, in particular institutions of civil society, which remain robust in Canada, and I quote, to develop the coalitions necessary to produce innovative approaches to digital democracy, and she means it, and she'll be working on it. Her title for us today is Critical Data Studies, or How to Desegregate Networks. Very important. Wendy.
Oh, I think we're feeding back each other. Okay. Oh, wow. Everyone can hear me and many me's. It's like the resonance of the glacier. I'm melting. Okay. This is better. Okay. So thank you, Kathy, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you, Debjani, for inviting me here today. It's been really thrilling, but I realize we're at the end of the day. So what I want us to do for this last hour, very much in sync with the panel that just happened, is to think through the possibilities and limitations of critical data studies. In particular, how critical data studies can help us understand how identity persists in the era of data-driven algorithms. So how categories such as gender, sexuality, race, and class persist and mutate in and through algorithms that are allegedly blind to them and are deliberately designed to blind us to them. Again, since it's late, when an exhausting and exhilarating day, I'm going to start as succinctly as possible. So I'm going to make 4 arguments. The first is that, as the current situation and past history of the internet makes clear, being blind to race blindly promotes racism. Ignoring difference amplifies discrimination. Secondly, to redress the situation, we need, amongst many other things, to expose and address the default assumptions and axioms that ground algorithms and data structures. Third, to fight discrimination, to create a more just and democratic future, we need to be a little perverse. And what I'm going to argue is that we need to perversely read the racist results of these algorithms as evidence of current discrimination. So in other words, as critical tools. And lastly, that we need, amongst, again, so many other things, to create new algorithms, new worlds. Okay, so hold on to these, and I'll start unpacking. But before I do, I just want to mention that it's part of a larger book project, Discriminating Data, Individuals, Networks, and Proxies, that examines how segregation, discrimination, and multiculturalism are legacy codes. Right? So the ways in which they endure within our algorithms. But crucially, the goal of the project isn't simply to uncover these legacy codes, but also to transform them. So to work with people across the humanities, the sciences, as well as the social sciences, to imagine different kinds of networks. And this is exactly what my new research group at SFU will be doing. And I'm happy to talk about the ways we'll be bringing together critical theory and network science. All I have to say is Canada has a great way of celebrating its birthday. We all should go to Canada. Okay. So part one, embodying critical data studies. Okay, so what is critical data studies? Why does it matter? Why should you care, especially as a humanist? Now, as many of you know, and this was discussed earlier, critical data studies is a new interdisciplinary field that explores the unique cultural, ethical, and critical challenges posed by big data. And here you see three influential definitions of critical data studies, right? So critical data studies starts from the premise that raw data is an oxymoron. It's never simply given. It's not unprocessed building material, but always cooked. Again, data as a medium, I think, was beautifully discussed earlier. Because data is never raw, critical data studies seeks answers to questions about the nature of data, how they're produced, organized, analyzed, and employed, and how best to make sense of them and the work they do. And at its best, critical data studies is wildly and unusually interdisciplinary, right? So people from the computer sciences to the social sciences to the humanities, I'm thinking of people like Cathy O'Neill as well as Kate Crawford, have argued that we all need to think together critically and creatively about data, algorithms, and artificial intelligence. And I'm going to move 21 here. I'm a little older than that, yeah. Critical data studies responds, of course, to the early hype around big data. And we've been told over and over again that data defines our present and future, right? So The Economist declared last year that data is the new oil, the new resource to be exploited, which also implies that it's also the new polluter, right? So I like to think of big data as the new coal, right? Okay, but why? What's so big or different about big data? Well, according to its proponents, big data changes the very quality of knowledge and thinking. It moves us from causality to correlation. It opens new doors by revealing real correlations that actually exist. So Kukier and Meyer-Schonenberg, for example, have argued that by allowing us to address the entire data set, big data moves us from the why to the how. Theory's dead because causality's dead. And instead of causes, we have real correlations, right? Which in essence are proxies. So we have proxies for certain behaviors that enable us to possess and predict the future. And what's important in this quotation here is that they argue that knowledge now means knowing the future rather than knowing the past. Maybe. But if this is so, it's because in these models, the future and the past are actually made to coincide. So structurally speaking, and I'll return to this point later, the past and the future are the same things, right? So the future and the past are missing but recreatable values. So consider this description of link prediction. What's key here, and what I want us to hold on to, is that the future state in a dynamic model, t+1, is calculated in the same way as missing data in the past, right? So the likely future equals the missing past. Now, there's a problem with discovering or recreating correlations. Namely, they conflict. We can come up with multiple and conflicting correlations all the time. And it seems that almost any correlation can be shown to exist. So here's the infamous study that showed that obesity spreads like a virus amongst friends, right? So it recycled data from the Framingham Heart Survey, and the Framingham Heart data was key to understanding heart disease. It recycled it in order to map obesity amongst friends. And it argued that more than your family, more than your physical neighborhood, your social neighborhood determined your likelihood to become obese. Now, this was critiqued for many reasons. Well, clearly, obesity is not a virus. This would seem to imply that if your friends start getting fat, you should just ditch them, right? And also because it conflated contagion with homophily, right? So the tendency of people who are alike to act alike. So in these models, mathematically, it's hard to separate viral spread from habitus. And it was also attacked because this wasn't the only correlation to be found. So this other study found the opposite to be true, that actually zip code and property value are the best predictors of weight. Okay, so given this, given that almost any correlation can be shown to be real, how do we know it's true? Even further, how does the discovery of these correlations impact the reality they allegedly simply described? And to make this clear, consider the recent pro-Republican BuzzFeed articles documenting Facebook and Google's inadvertent use of racist phrases to sell targeted ads. So Google suggested all sorts of racist advertising keywords to add to white people ruin. And Facebook enabled advertisers to reach people using anti-Semitic phrases drawn from the interests of users determined to be like them. But every week, it seems, we're confronted with a new story about discriminating algorithms. So 2 years ago, a coalition of civil liberties and civil rights organizations issued a statement against predictive policing technologies. And according to this group, the crime data that was embedded within these algorithms reinforced disproportionate and discriminatory policing practices. But this, again, was just two of many. Others include Sophia Noble's really excellent recent book on how searches on Black women perpetuate porn and racism, and revelations that the software used by US courts, many US courts, to predict the risk of recidivism, and therefore is used by courts, many courts, to decide on sentencing as well as parole, is biased against racial minorities. So these programs, as Cathy O'Neill has documented in her book, become or threaten to become what she calls weapons of math destruction. Okay, but if this is true, what can we do, right? What can we do to make things right? And O'Neill stresses transparency. We need to know what goes into these algorithms. We need to know under what basis we're being hired and fired. Absolutely. But as Kate Crawford and others have shown, the problem is that race, gender, and other protected categories are present even when they're not. So even programs that don't explicitly use race as a category implicitly do so, in particular through proxies and through neighborhood predictors. So as the ProRepublica article revealed, the factors that weigh into your risk assessment are proxies for race. Right? So here you see how race is linked to the factors such as man with no high school education degree and single and don't have a job correlate to race. So the proprietary COMPASS program, which has been unsuccessfully sued, asked people to fill out a questionnaire. And this questionnaire asked them questions like these, but it also asked about a person's friends and families. And so we don't know exactly how these things are weighed because, again, the algorithm's proprietary, but it's pretty clear that your friends matter, right? And that your sentencing depends on who you know and who people think you know. So one of the questions that's actually asked of a police officer is, do you think this person is part of a gang? And this is even clearer still in the Chicago police heat list. So the Chicago police, in order to combat the homicide rate in Chicago, came up with this brilliant idea. They were going to come up with a list of the 400 people most likely to kill or be killed, and then visit the top 12, warn them of their ways so they would change. Yeah, sounds like a TV show, doesn't it? Yeah, okay. Now, to come up with this heat list, the Chicago police didn't use overtly racial categories, and they didn't just study people's actual behaviors. They studied their social networks. So they put people on the heat list not solely based on their past behavior, but also because of the actions and history of their algorithmically determined network neighbors. So because of their friends, they became persons of interest. And race didn't need to be an overt factor because it was already factored in through a long history of segregation and discrimination. And it was also factored in, and I want to unpack this a little, because network neighborhoods presume segregation. They segregate users into clusters based on similarities. And this resegregation matters because networks create structures and consequences. So the heat list actually didn't bring down the number of homicides, but it led to people being identified on that list becoming 2.88 times more likely to be arrested. And what it also led to, as this one person pointed out, was the possibility of the people who are identified and visited themselves becoming murdered, right? Because these people had relatively clean rap sheets. So as McDaniel pointed out, when the police visited him, he became afraid that his neighbors would think that he had become a snitch. Right? Now, a lot of pushback and criticism has focused on the use of racial categories rather than racism. Right? So the belief is, if we only got rid of ways of tracking race, if we only didn't see race, things would be okay. As though the problem were the simple existence of proxies within models rather than what these proxies do, what relations these proxies set up. This is like condemning language for having metaphors rather than thinking through the specificity of the metaphor. Right? And we have to remember that these programs were sold as solving the problem of individual bias. Right? So Facebook fired all its human editors after it was accused of being biased against conservative news. Right? So machines, it's assumed, can't see difference and thus can't be biased. Although more cynically, and I think more truthfully, they thought that these algorithms can't talk to reporters off the record yet, right? And COMPASS was sold as solving the problem of individual bias. So your sentencing, studies have shown, depends on your judge's circadian rhythms. So before lunch, when the judge is hungry, you're far more likely to get a longer sentence, right? So the idea was to take out individual bias, but the problem was it was then replaced with collective bias. And we also have to remember that the internet itself was remember the internet? It wasn't supposed to be this trash fire, right? It was supposed to solve the problem of racial discrimination, because online, nobody knew who you were, right? Remember cyberspace, right? So we need to take on the hard question, how can we address racism in the face of the constant erasure of race? And to do this, we need to examine the fundamental assumptions baked into network science, because baked within networks, as they're currently conceived, are fundamental assumptions of segregation, discrimination, and history. Which brings me to part 2, our cybergenic moments. Okay, to get us thinking about this, I'm going to show you just a few minutes from that controversial Cambridge Analytica video.
Clearly, demographics and geographics and economics will influence your worldview. But equally important, or probably more important, are psychographics. That is an understanding of your personality, because it's personality that drives behavior, and behavior that obviously influences how you vote. So how is this possible? Well, at Cambridge, we've rolled out a long-form quantitative instrument to probe the underlying traits that inform personality. This is the cutting edge in experimental psychology known as the OCEAN model. OCEAN being an acronym for openness, how open you are to new experiences. Conscientiousness, whether you prefer order and habits and planning in your life. Extroversion, how social you are. Agreeableness, whether you put other people's needs and society and community ahead of yourself. And finally, neuroticism, a measurement of how much you tend to worry. By having hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Americans undertake this survey, we were able to form a model to predict the personality of every single adult in the United States of America. So how does this impact marketing and communications in elections? For a primary, the Second Amendment might be a popular issue amongst the electorate. If you know the personality of the people you're targeting, you can nuance your messaging to resonate more effectively with those key audience groups. So, for a highly neurotic and conscientious audience, you're going to need a message that is rational and fear-based or emotionally based. In this case, the threat of a burglary and the insurance policy of a gun is very persuasive. Conversely, for a closed and agreeable audience, these are people who care about tradition and habits and family and community. This could be the grandfather who taught his son to shoot and the father who will in turn teach his son. Obviously, talking about these values is going to be much more effective in communicating your message.
Great. Okay, so Cambridge Analytica claims to know your personality even if you've never filled out a survey, because it's discovered proxies, such as buying an American car, or, and these proxies don't age well, right? So how many people like Lady Gaga, right? Apparently you're an extrovert, but I think at this point it just shows how old you are as well, right? And if you like philosophy, you're apparently an introvert. Right? Now, you'll note, although they claim not to use race, right, this is supposed to be better than race, the face of conscientious neuroticism was a well-groomed white female. Right? And according to Christopher Wiley, the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower, Bannon was the only straight man he's met who understands feminist intersectional politics. So why we need to think race, class, gender, sexuality together. And intersectionality theory, of course, comes from women of color feminists such as Kimberly Crenshaw. Bannon apparently sees culture as central to politics. He adheres to what's been called the Breitbart doctrine, that you have to change culture to change politics. And according to Wiley, Cambridge Analytica went one step further and argued that to change culture, you have to change people. People are the units of culture. Now, we need to take all these claims with a grain of salt. There's a lot we don't know, and we can't definitively know about the impact of Cambridge Analytica. So the problem is that there's a lot of false positives. We don't know how many people would have voted for Brexit or voted for Trump anyway, regardless of Cambridge Analytica. And blaming Cambridge Analytica for everything means we avoid talking about other issues, right? But what's crucial is that these ads, this campaign, was conceived of as an emotional experience, as a transformational emotional experience. So the goal was to get you to take the red pill, to take that one click and then go down the rabbit hole, and then to have you go through a series of sites all saying the same thing, so you returned back a different person, right? Or that you make some hacker who's figured out the difference between auctions on Facebook and Google really rich, right? Now, even though Cambridge Analytica claimed that individuals are the unit of culture, what they sought to do was manipulate clusters. So the goal was to put you in an echo chamber with people like you, with whom you share a secret or a passion, with whom you share the same triggers, and then get you to spam each other relentlessly. So these ads, again, were designed to accentuate fear, angst, and humor, to place people in a highly affective condition, because when people are most agitated or most affirmed, they act most predictably, because they act in response to triggers. And again, folk are put into network neighborhoods not based on the majority of their likes, but the intensity of their odd likes and dislikes. So based on how they deviate most distinctly from the norm with others, right? So based on seemingly authentic moments, where authenticity, being yourself, means deviating slightly from the norm, right? So here you see Twitter's message to me. So Twitter thinks I'm really stupid, because I have thousands of followers and only hundreds of tweets, right? So it's telling me to be myself, right? It's therefore assuming that if I'm silent, I'm hiding something, I'm being inauthentic, rather than maybe I'm just Canadian, right? And there's a ton more to say about authenticity as training people to behave slightly badly. And there's a reason why authenticity is such a buzzword now in advertising, and why the 2016 elections were called the authenticity elections. There's a ton more to say, but I don't have time. But I want you to consider this study, which revealed how easy it is to reveal a person's age and gender based on their publicly declared Facebook likes. So as Kaczynski et al. Revealed in this much cited and highly influential 2013 PNAS article, it's really easy to determine, that is to authenticate, a user's race, gender, and sexuality based on publicly available information. And in 2013, Facebook likes were publicly available. And partly in response to research like this, they became private. Now, they came up with predictions not only for physical traits such as race and gender, but also psychological traits. And this is because over 58,000 volunteers filled out, remember that crazy personality questionnaire that went around Facebook saying, do you want to know what kind of personality type you are? This is where it all went. Okay. Now, if these categories look familiar and the name Kaczynski rings a bell, it's because he's become notorious for alleged links between his research and Cambridge Analytica. But to produce these results, the users basically created a vast user-like matrix, which they then decomposed into the 100 most relevant components. Okay, so what you're seeing here are the most correlated likes for IQ and sexuality. Look at these closely. Okay. Now, what's key is that you matter, your actions matter, not in isolation, but in relation to others. Data is most valuable, most useful for prediction and identification only when it's authenticated with and against others deemed to be like you, right? So through your neighbors, people who are deemed to be like you because they like what you like and they hate what you hate, you're captured even when you're silent. So Kaczynski used an initial training set of users and likes to come up with a weighted correlation matrix that was then used to predict the status of others. And this is much clearer in their 2015 article where they lay out their method for matching personality types. So basically, they used 90% of their data as a training set to build a linear regression model. They tested it against the remaining 10%, and then they predicted your identity, your personality type, by weighing your manifest actions. Now, this clustering isn't innocent. It creates and is used to create identities and borders. Again, what's important isn't the majority of likes. What's important are likes that divide. So it's not that everybody who has a high IQ likes curly fries, but those who are deemed not to have a high IQ don't like curly fries. Right? So these are odd, specialized likes that cluster because they divide. These correlations, in other words, build walls. And these walls occur at many different levels because network science presumes segregation. So at the heart of network science is the axiom that similarity breeds connection, that birds of a feather flock together, that like acts like like. So this is one of the most cited review articles on homophily, making the case that similarity breeds connection. And homophily drives collaborative filtering. So collaborative filtering groups users and objects into neighborhoods based on their boundary-defining likes and dislikes. Homophily structures networks by creating clusters and thus make networks both searchable and predictable. Now, what's so insidious about these neighborhood models is that they assume that neighborhoods should be segregated, that neighbors should be people who are like ourselves, so that if you show your love by hating others, by fleeing when others show up, and this is particularly clear in the Schelling model, this reveals that if we manage somehow to love our neighbors like ourselves, it's literally because they are ourselves, which massively perverts all Judeo-Christian-based ethics, right? And a really retrograde notion of identity drives homophily. Right? And here you see the definition of homophily from one of the most respected textbooks on network science. And I want to underscore that I have the deepest respect for Kleinberg and Easley and their work. It's brilliant. But think of all the assumptions embedded in this statement. Think of everything you have to accept as natural for this to be true. So what do methods like k-nearest neighbors presume? And not accidentally, Kleinberg and Easley actually take as evidence of homophily US residential segregation. But think of all the training, the planning needed to make this true. Think of the history of state-sanctioned segregation within the United States. Institutional histories that have been analyzed by folks such as Nightingale, Rothstein, and Katz-Nelson. We have to remember that there are no random defaults. Right? And why are their defaults called your preferences? Right? What's at stake in this move? And importantly, the links between homophily and US residential segregation are deep and profound. Homophily was actually first coined in 1954 by sociologists Lazarsfeld and Merton. And in that chapter, they also coined the term heterophily, a term that's been completely erased. But what's also been completely erased, and this article is cited thousands upon thousands of times. What's been, sorry, got excited. I'm a little short. So what's been completely erased is that these people came up with this term while studying segregation in US residential housing projects, right? So they came up with the term homophily, actually value homophily, while looking at the responses of white neighbors to each other within this mixed race housing project. Whether liberals overselected for liberals, illiberals overselected for illiberals. Now, in order to make this case, they actually had to ignore all the responses by the black residents, because they all believed that housing should be desegregated. And there's a ton more to say. And so they analyzed these two different families. Crafttown is an all-white co-op that was built for shipyard workers right after Pearl Harbor. But they never look into, and they say this is an ideal housing project. There's lots of civic, whatever thingamajigger it is. Morale, yes, and action. But they never say, why is this all white? Does it have to do something with what the FHA would actually ensure in terms of housing, right? They don't look at the difference that ownership makes and how this legacy persists. And there's a ton more to say about homophily and its links to racist reactions against desegregation. And here I think Schelling's model is really key for us to unpack, as well as Sarah Ahmed's diagnosis of white supremacism as rewriting hate as love, but again, no time. Because I want to at least touch on the historical ties between eugenics and the statistical methods being deployed in machine learning. Okay, so again, big data is so big because it relies on correlation rather than causality. Rather than making hypotheses about why things happen, it enables us to know the future by revealing hidden but actually existing correlations. And this means we can know the future. So consider again the correlations for IQ, right? And the standard line, again, is that these are just correlations. And these correlations are important and they're effective because they reveal what's really there. Okay, but how are correlations constructed? And what do they mean? So not surprisingly, the Pearson correlation coefficient used in many recommendation systems to determine similarity and linear regression were developed as tools to prove the truth of eugenics. They were developed as tools to understand human heredity. So Pearson and Galton were both eugenicists, and they developed the statistical method still used to determine correlation because they were interested in diagnosing what they thought of as a literal regression or reversion to the mean that plagued 19th and early 20th century English society. So Galton developed linear regression, which is now used to determine the best fitting line between scattered points in order to understand deviation. So most simply, linear regression assumes a linear relationship between an independent and dependent variable, such as the classic is, of course, y equals mx plus b, where m and b are constants. Now, intriguingly, Galton's conception of linear regression differs in purpose and in order from this now standard procedure. So Galton specifically formulated the notion of linear reversion while studying the difference in size between sweet peas and their offspring, and later heights between human parents and of exceptional heights and their offspring. So as you see here, and that's his line over there, he drew a line and sought to determine the slope not between 2 points in a given graph, but rather between the deviations from the mean, right? Because what mattered to Galton was showing how exceptional traits were lost generation by generation if they weren't carefully bred. And Pearson and Galton were biometricians rather than Mendelians, right? Mendel was theory. And Pearson, in particular, viewed correlation as a necessary supplement to causality. And his argument for correlation over causality eerily resonates with current views on correlation as somehow theory-free. And here you see Pearson's solution for a better T+1, a eugenic logic that uses the inheritance of unchanging attributes to build the future. But it's not just Pearson and Galton. It's not just regression and correlation, but also methods that ground pattern recognition. Okay. So look at one of the first cases for the automated construction of decision trees. And this is taken from Adrian Mackenzie's fantastic new book, Machine Learners, in which he argues that pattern recognition instrumentalizes differences. but look at what differences it trains on. And it's not just examples or data used to generate decision trees or classification and regression keys. The very notion of node purity or impurity resonates with eugenics. And then it's telling that the impurity measure for classification trees, as Mackenzie notes, is the Gini index of diversity. Diversity undermines pattern recognition. It undermines node purity. Support vector machines, which are key to pattern recognition, stemmed from linear discriminators, which were developed by another British eugenicist and another father of modern statistics and genetics, Sir Ronnie Fisher. And he developed linear discriminators, as the name implies, to discriminate between species and races, to mark the difference, to render continuous changes into discrete traits. In other words, to mark the edges of races. So the point was to find the boundaries between similarly mixed cases. And Fisher drew from I'm going to butcher the name. Thank you. Could you say that louder, please? Thank you. Mahalanobis's cranionobric work in India. And Mahalanobis wanted to determine the effects of racial mixing within the Indian population. So he starts by considering English-Indian hybrids, but then ends by arguing that there's always been hybridization, but only within equal castes. So support vector machines, with its use of high-dimensional space to amplify borders, complicates linear discriminators, but the principle of focusing on and determining boundaries remains the same. Right? And Fisher, like Pearson, wanted to change the future using eugenics, based on unchanging characteristics that let the past and the future be calculated in the same way. So he, like Pearson, believed that intelligence was hereditary. And because of this, Fisher was against all programs of social uplift. He argued that attempts at wholesale social promotion led to the retardation of the cultural progress of every class of the community and put an unneeded strain on the educational system. So he was against public education. His solution, actually, to the decline of the English society in the early 20th century was actually to give more money to rich people so they would reproduce more. So the goal was to make sexual selection and natural selection coincide, so that the English could once more act like authentic, heroic barbarians. Sound familiar? Now, to be clear, my point isn't that any use of these methods and statistics is eugenicist, but rather, if the world seems closed to us now, it's because these methods were designed to predict the future based on an unchanging past. Right? So in this world, there is no nurture, only nature. There are no deviations except for statistical noise. As Pearson put it, intelligence cannot be learned, it can only be bred. In this present, the future can be calculated, but it can't be radically different from the past. So if the past is racist, right, a model is only verified as true if it too produces racist results. Right? Okay, so what to do? What can we do about this? So just very, very, very briefly, from correlation to correlation. So first of all, we have to realize that the proliferation of echo chambers and segregation is not inevitable. And we never have to accept segregation. And although this will entail more than different networks and algorithms, algorithms are a great place to start. So what if we treated those algorithms like COMPAS, like global climate change models, right? So think of what global climate change models do. They give us a future we don't want. They give us the next likely step, so we'll do something different. They use probability to open political possibilities, right? We're not like, yes, let's do everything possible so we can get to like a 10-degree increase as soon as possible, right? So the question is, what if we analyzed social networking models and their political consequences, not so we could determine, did they really have the impact they claim to have, but to ask, what factors have been put in place? What present are we living in that these futures seem plausible? So what if we treated these models and results as pointing to underlying problems that we need to fight? Right? What if we use the gap between model prediction and reality as the grounds for political action, while at the same time realizing, and this is why global climate change models are again so key, that what we need now isn't more models, we need actions. Right? So, and in many ways, producing more models that uncover what's blatantly obvious can at times be an alibi for inaction. Right? Now, these actions, these imaginings can start with networks. They can start by reimagining these networks. So what different future could we imagine? What different future could we create together by simply questioning our habits and our defaults, by probing the literary and performative roots of authenticity? And importantly, Milton Friedman, the evil architect of neoliberalism, urged his followers, hey, if they can use intersectionality, we can use Milton Friedman, okay? Urged his followers to focus not on disruption of crises, these happen all the time in a capitalist society, but rather habits. So he admonished his followers to seed new habits so that the improbable becomes probable. So what would happen if we took these correlations and turned them into correlations? What would happen if we used the fact that Wu-Tang Clan is one of the most correlated likes for male heterosexuality as a way to explode male heterosexuality? Like, let's think a moment about Wu-Tang Clan. What do we do with this mix of Hong Kong martial arts, cinema, Staten Island hip hop, and Jacques Cousteau, right? What would happen if we explored how we're all entangled? What would happen if we explored how our actions affect one another, how every individual is collectively formed, right? So what would happen if we weren't shunted into homophilous echo chambers? What would emerge if these clusters actually explore difference rather than similarities? What would happen if we built models based on heterophily, on the notion that opposites attract rather than homophily, right? This is how electromagnetism operates. Apparently, electricity works. How many of you know people who are heterosexual? Okay, so this is called reverse gender homophily. So apparently, this can happen as well. What if we also, better yet, thought about mutual indifference as a way to connect people, right? What other modes of navigation and recommendation could be revealed? That is, what if we took the Gambahi River Collective's challenge to treat all people as levelly human? And this collective of Black women was one of the first to theorize what's become intersectionality. So the importance of thinking race, sexuality, class, and gender together. And it's from their embrace of identity that they call for a level humanity, for a recognition that belies pattern recognition. And for all of you who haven't yet seen Daphne Brooks, Kara Keeling, and Jackie Stewart do a revival of this through this amazing mixtape, you should see them. Invite them onto campus. They're incredible. Okay. And Data for Black Lives Matter has argued that in light of Cambridge Analytica, anonymized Facebook data should be made available, that data belongs to users, that the kinds of privacy that Facebook has offered is woefully inadequate and damaging. And there's a long history in the US of defining privacy, who has the right to privacy in racial terms. And I'll just refer here to work of Hortense Spillers and Eden Osucha. Now, this call raises all sorts of questions about the adequate anonymization of data. But it also points out that networks are fundamentally public. So what if, rather than retreating into bizarre notions of privacy that actually undermine our safety, we took on the very public nature of networks and the collective nature of identity? So what if we came up and developed public rights? What if we, following Kara Keeling's call, took care of our bodies and identities, not because they simply belong to us, but they don't, but because they're collective, and because we constantly expose and touch each other with our every actions? So what if we used our data shadows to create public spaces in which we were all open and vulnerable and yet not attacked? Thank you.
Yes, my name is Uli Bear. I'm at New York University. Thank you, first of all, for this fascinating talk. I thought it was fantastic and really very, very, very important for how we all sort of captured today. You made a comment about the friend, neighbor, neighbor, love your neighbor comment, and you said it would be going in the face of all our Judeo-Christian belief, but there's a critique of Judeo-Christian belief as actually you're supposed to love your neighbor as long as he or she is a Christian or a Jew, and sort of there's a kind of inbuilt mechanism of conversion and participation in the group rather than the universal love. So I just was interested in if you could say a little bit more of what would be the model to use love as a universal category, because the Judeo-Christian, which you bracketed out as that has also been critiqued as saying, no, it's not a universal, but it just applies as long as everybody becomes converted to my faith.
Yeah, no, there's a great book that was co-produced by Santner on the whole question of loving your neighbor, right, which makes this point. And so part of it was facetious in making that, but also trying to get to that longer history. Now, what's incredibly interesting, I have to tell you, this has been so mind-blowingly crazy in the sense that I've been starting to revisit that data that was all chucked out and saying, if we didn't take out all these responses, what other models would we have? What could we build? Now, what's interesting is Merton is reading Freud at this point on neighbors as enemies, right? There's also a whole other studies of neighbors that he's looking at. So I think part of what I'm trying to do is reach into that deep history of the neighbor, right? And to say that it's completely flattened if we only understand it in terms of neighbor equals self, which is what these clusters presume, right? But I do think that the question of antagonism is central.
There's a question down here.
Right.
Would you stand up too?
Oh, sure. Amazing, awesome talk. So I enjoyed your reference to Mackenzie in the recent book, and I would say belying the talk is this idea of performativity at some level, which is to say, by kind of focusing on amplifying, extenuating these kinds of difference, we end up reinforcing these differences, we end up expecting these kinds of difference, we end up, performing and actuating these differences. And I'm interested to see how you think we do that. I think there are many, many ways. I mean, one, just as I was sitting here, is the idea that in some sense, the more powerful the predictor, the less likely the less likely we are to be able to ask to open it, right? So in some sense, the better the predictor kind of facilitates its power in keeping itself closed. But I think there are many, many different ways, and I'm curious to kind of hear these mechanisms by which you think these things, end up reinforcing the world, because in some sense, exposing that becomes part of the precondition to this broader project.
Right. Yeah, no, thank you. I think that the question of performativity in networks is absolutely key, and I use it slightly different than Kieran Healy does, right? So Kieran Healy has a great article on the performativity of networks, where he actually makes a comparison between network science and economics, and as to what extent was the implementation of these models actually put in place the thing that it was predicting. And he does it from a very sociological point of view. I think that one example that's been brought up, and this is brought up by people in industry, is that recommendation engines have shunted people towards certain objects so that serendipitous purchases no longer happen. So what's interesting is that homophily is an easy problem. It's low-lying fruit. That then makes everything low-lying fruit. And so industry itself is interested in this because everyone's being shunted into these same products, right? So that's one sort of commercial view of it. But again, what is so key for me is, first of all, so the part of the project is to say, okay, what happens if we revisit these fundamental precepts of network science, both historically and theoretically? Okay, let's rethink homophily. If you rethink homophily, you actually have to revisit the history of US residential segregation. If you actually revisit the data and you do it rigorously, you actually would come up with a model that's different. So part of it is to go back and to rethink these models. Then the other point is to think through time how these models have affected both physical and virtual environments, right? So the difference that housing policies had on actual neighborhoods, as well as its manifestations within these clusters. Another example that's really key, and which I didn't talk about, is Schelling's dynamic models of segregation, right? So this is one of the most influential agent-based models. And he allegedly showed, where are you? Here you are, Schelling. Okay. So he allegedly showed that in a system in which people are willing to be in a minority, segregation would still emerge, right? So he presumed a chart of X's and O's. Everyone is an X and O, and cares how many X and O's are around them, right? And if you do this, he said, even if you have people willing to be in the minority, what you'll have is an overarching situation of segregation, right? And so so Kleinberg and Easley redid the thing using a computer model, and this is what they showed, that after 800 steps, you get complete segregation based on a T equals 4. So people were willing to have neighborhoods of the same kind. And so that they conclude is that the underpinnings of segregation are already present in a system in which individuals simply want to avoid being too extreme a minority in their own local area. And they say the problem is that it's too hard for them to perceive these things, right? But the problem with this formulation is that there is no random start. There is no random start, so therefore the pattern that emerges matters. And secondly, Schelling himself in dynamic models of segregation says two main processes of segregation are admitted. One is organized, so he doesn't look at all in terms of institutions in order to come up with this voluntary model, right? And second, he says he's not going to look at economics. This is an economist saying he's not going to look at economics, right, in order to produce this. So I think part of it, again, is to say, if we look at these models, we place this in the Constitution, and Schelling is writing right as busing is about to begin in Boston. Right? And so let's take the voices of the civil rights activists. Let's take these other voices and these other data also and movements that were in place and see what would happen if we considered those together.
We have a question right here. Would you stand up, please? Thank you.
Becca, oh, sorry. Thank you so much for this. I heard a shorter version at SCMS and I was in the corner on the floor, so I got to actually understand more this time. So I had a question. I've been thinking about it for months, and I want to ask you a little bit about the we, like who the we is, because I imagine going back to my campus and talking to, say, the business faculty, and I imagine they would say something like, okay, yes, but markets. The we means that, you know, there's a way in which people will desire, there's a way in terms of selling homophily is the thing that will work, and then when it's not, if it's heterophily, it's going to be aspirational. And so no matter what you sort of imagine could be the we about why, you know, what's our incentive. And then I imagine talking to the political scientists, and they'd say, oh, but there's this sort of rational behavior in terms of, you know, homophily and like why we're doing it. So yes, it's sort of predicting sort of past models, but that's still rational in terms of the utopian desire they have, even if it may not be ours, because of course we don't, but they do. And I imagine the computer scientists might have something to say, but they never taught to me, and I don't know what that would be. But you might know what some of them would say, so I'd just be curious what you think.
All right. Thank you for that question. I'm sorry you were in the corner. Yeah. Yeah, it was a fantastic panel with Lisa Nakamura and Tara McPherson and Kara Keeling. Okay, so that's an excellent question. But one thing I think what we need to do is realize that heterophily is not aspirational, right? If heterosexuality happens all the time, then heterophily is not aspirational, right? If electromagnetism happens, heterophily is not aspirational. So we have to ask ourselves, under what conditions are we living in? Has homophily become so naturalized that we think of heterophily as aspirational? And what's interesting, to go back to the Merton study again, is that they go through the various factors of homophily within these two communities, and they say that the only factors that are homophilous or show homophily are gender and race. Right? So I think that's part of it. Now, in terms of speaking to a business faculty member, again, I think it is well recognized within, well, first of all, Silicon Valley is in a little bit of trouble right now because suddenly they're realizing they're media companies. They're being told they're media companies. They don't know what that means, right? So this means that every school is now going to have a media studies program in order to, because Silicon Valley needs it. So if you want to sell the humanities in the university, point to the crisis of Silicon Valley and show that it's because they don't fully understand what media is that they're in the boat they are now. And that media studies needs a humanistic, an interdisciplinary approach. Okay. So they know that. But they also know that in terms of the fact that, again, the people are being shunted. People think that they have more choice than ever before, but as an aggregate, they're actually buying more of the same things. So it's individual diversity, aggregate lack of diversity. Okay. So that's perhaps one way to talk to your econ folk. In terms of political scientists and political theorists, I think that the question that becomes really key is democracy and agonistic, right? As well as trying to think through how communities are being defined, right? And what needs to go into place in order for these seemingly voluntary associations to emerge. Right? And in terms of computer scientists, I work with computer scientists. I mean, they're nice people. I mean, I was an engineer. I mean, geeks are good. And there are actually a lot of engineers, and I get this in my students, my undergraduates all the time, who say, you know, help me, I want to make a better world. Like, what can we do? And I think that reaching those students, I mean, you have union organizing amongst Facebook employees. I mean, you have all sorts of really interesting things happening, not unrelatedly because of the housing crisis in Silicon Valley, right? So I think that there are ways in which what we need to do, and what I find works out well with interdisciplinary work, is we all have to find out the question we're interested in and realize we can't solve it on our own. We can't solve the problem of discrimination in any discipline on our own, right? We need each other to take on this question. This project all started out because, so Brown, I don't know, this is being recorded, right? But things can be deleted, right? So like, So sometimes I think like the US academia is a bad case of survivor, right? So you go on these projects and you're supposed to come up with these things and then only a few get funded. So this started out with a data initiative, and they said, we're going to put together humanists, that was me, the head of computer science and a biostatistician person together, and you're going to come up with a big data initiative. And we just sat there and looked at each other and said, we're not going to cooperate unless we all figure out a question that we care about. And so we figured that the question that we cared about was actually the relationship between what's real and what's true and what actually provokes political action. And then what really is important about interdisciplinary work is you have to be willing to challenge each other's first principles in the night, right? So I think we need that middle ground of figuring out the questions we care about and the ways that we realize we have our own blindnesses within our disciplines.
We had one more question over here. Premise.
Sorry.
But we're going to make it short.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. Thank you very much. I'm completely persuaded by the argument, and I wondered if you could help us to think a little bit about what kinds of re-scripting of the problematic of race is underway in the kinds of questions of the algorithm that you're putting forward. So it seems like the question of blood and skin has been displaced and supplemented with something else. So something new is happening to the script of race. The second question I have is really around the word predictor, predictability, and I wondered whether we ought to think more sharply about this question in terms of preemption. Because it seems to me that preemption displaces something like anticipation, which seemed to have been, the kind of formative idea of the emancipatory movements of the 20th century.
Yep. No, absolutely. I think that the move to preemption is a key one, but it's being called prediction. So what's key is that what is preemption is being called prediction, right? So the idea is by even describing the situation, you fundamentally change the situation. And here I think Agree's work on capture, Phil Agree's work on capture is really key. And the ways he talks about capture as a linguistic system that fundamentally alters the thing that it also captures. In terms of race and what's happening, yes, it's being changed into something that's quote unquote discovered through preferences, right? And here I think Sophia Noble's book, Algorithms of Repression, is really important. And what she looks at is the ways in which search terms for certain terms like black women get pornographic sites, right? So the ways in which these things are being rewritten through these correlations. And I think she's done a great job in thinking through the ways in which this clustering both reinforces these stereotypes and also embeds them in different ways.
All right, and with that, we're going to thank you again. Wonderful talk.